First of all, I just want to thank everyone who's been following along with us as we go down this podcast path. Having had the opportunity to do this for the past 2 years has been far more than a blessing. We've learned so many valuable lessons from the podcast itself, but also from you guys, the viewers, and the guests that we've had on the show. Quick channel update, we're going to start going to different shows around to do videos and interviews, so if you guys know anything cool, leave a comment down below and we'll get on that. Also, if you guys like ghost stories, we pretty much have a ghost story at the end of every episode, so check those out if you didn't know. And without further ado, to introduce today's guest, this is someone that I've had tried for over a year to get on the show with different scheduling issues. It hasn't been that easy, but we finally did it. Scott, as a man experienced in fact and observation in marine biology, he found himself fascinated with mob culture after watching classic movies. In Tampa, he began researching our city's history and has now published several books like Cigar City Mafia, A Complete History of Tampa Underworld, and The Silent Dawn, The Criminal Underworld of Santo Trafficante Junior. He's been all over TV, on radio shows, he's written several articles regarding Tampa's mob history. As always, leave a comment and like if you found something cool, subscribe for more great reviews like this one, grab some snacks and enjoy.
So I started kind of just reading about mob stuff after I saw Goodfellas in the movies, aging myself here a little bit. And I read the book. It was based on Wise Guy by Nick Pileggi. And at that time, there weren't a real ton of books about organized crime out. So I read what was available and just became kind of like a hobby interest. So in 95, I moved here down to St. Pete, Tampa area. And was going online at that time. There wasn't much online, but there was a guy that had this Mafia website. It was one of those text websites. You just kept having to scroll. There were no pages.
An old website. Yeah.
Old school, yeah. And I met a couple people on there, and there was this one gentleman he was actually over in the UK. He was a history guy, and he said, "Hey, I see you're in the Tampa area. What do you know about the Mafia in Tampa?" I said, "I really don't know much." And he said, "Well, I have some newspaper articles and some congressional hearings, and worked out a deal," and he sent me over this package, and it was a copy of these hearings that took place in downtown Tampa in 1950, the Kefauver hearings. Mm-hmm. And the Kefauver hearings went around to about a dozen cities around the country that were heavily corrupt and mob influenced, Tampa being one of them. And I started reading these stories about gangland killings and gambling and all this stuff going on, and that kind of opened up the floodgates into just really kind of a obsession. And then I started writing a little bit for some online sites and kind of culminated with my first book in 2004. And that's been kind of nonstop since then.
So you met this person on that website that you were reading about? Oh,
yeah,
okay.
His name is David Critchley. He's actually written a really good book about the early history of organized crime in New York, and we've kept in touch over the years. And there's really kind of a cadre of mob authors and researchers, and we all kind of interact and have known each other. And
when was that back then that you found him online?
95.
That's a crazy experience.
Yeah.
You just find a random person online. He's like, "Hey, I got all these files and documents. I'll send it to you."
Yeah, he was on that site posting, and we just started talking. Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. It's the first example of but that being said, back then when I was doing research, especially for my first book, Cigar City Mafia, cheap plug there. Mm-hmm. A lot of that stuff, there wasn't anything. It was hard to research online. You had to really go. I had to go to the National Archives. I had to go to the Old Tampa Tribune and go through their files by hand. And it was fun. Don't get me wrong, that stuff's kind of cool, but very time consuming. As things have changed over the years, now I can do so much more research online.
It's all over Google everywhere.
Yeah, there's FBI files, repositories for that.
Mm-hmm.
You find a ton of stuff like Ancestry. Those there's a lot more availability. Even if you can't actually find it specifically online, you can find where it's located, where it's housed, if it's in this collection of papers. So yeah, that's made a tremendous difference in research.
So what exactly were the Kefauver files? It sounds like some sketchy files that you delivered to the cities who were down with it.
So the Kefauver was a senator from Tennessee, Estes Kefauver, and he was kind of leading these congressional hearings. And when they got to Tampa, really the crux was the mob's control of illegal gambling in Tampa, and specifically the political corruption that came from that. So there was a lot of talk about Sheriff Hugh Culbreth, who was the sheriff in Tampa at that time, and his involvement with organized crime figures in Tampa. Businesses they owned, businesses they ran. There was also hearings in Miami, and there were some of the connections there between what was going on in Tampa, what was going on in Miami. Tampa had its own homegrown mafia and organized crime situation, whereas Miami was an open city where mobsters and gangsters from all over kind of plied their trade, but there was still a connection between them. So it really was the first time, too, for a lot of people that lived in Tampa. They really got to – it kind of pulled the cover over.
They hadn't
cover up.
known prior to that? What time period were these hearings happening?
1950.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it already had been growing by this time.
Exactly.
The first time that we were trying to deal with it as, I guess, a society?
And it really – the other thing the Kefauver hearings did, which was different at the time – I mean, people knew there were gangsters like Capone and organized crime, but it really kind of solidified that. And the Tampa ones were not that I'm aware of, but some of the ones, like the ones in New York, were televised, and this is in the really early years of television.
Oh,
so it was the first time like they actually saw some of these gangsters, like Frank Costello or something, like on TV,
trying to testify, I am not a gangster.
Exactly.
Kind of like the communist trials. Like you see Dr. Seuss going up there saying the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. So
what was like, I guess, the prominent crime for the mob families in Tampa back then? Like, what was their export, if you will?
So the predominant moneymaker for organized crime, well, there were a couple. During the Prohibition era, Tampa was a big port of entry for illegal liquor, primarily coming via Cuba, because there was a very vibrant trade between Port Tampa Bay and Havana. They were also bringing in narcotics. A lot of narcotics were coming through Tampa, and they were bringing in people. There was a lot of smuggling of Chinese immigrants through Cuba and through Ybor City, and they were shipped up to different cities around the United States. But if I were to say what was the dominant moneymaker, it was illegal gambling. It was really the big moneymaker. A game called Bolita was really the kind of the linchpin, and it kind of expands out to other types of gambling.
Mm-hmm. The Bolita, that's more. It's like kind of like the lottery, right? Kind of like a community lottery type thing.
Yeah, it's like a community lottery. It's kind of eventually becomes like just a general numbers racket. So the best way for your listeners, if you go in now to Publix and play your pick three, back then when there was no lottery, you'd go find your Bolita guy and play your Bolita numbers.
But that was illegal at the time?
It was illegal.
Is it legal now to do something like that?
Well, it's the lottery now.
Wasn't it like the whole community would like pitch in some money, and then like one person in the community would win the money? Is that what that was?
No, you can buy individual Bolita numbers. You can buy them. A great story. I talked to an undercover vice cop who used to stake out this butcher shop because the butcher used to be the Bolita seller. There was a guy that ran an ice cream truck that used to sell Bolita, and I had this woman that I spoke to, maybe it's about a year and a half ago now, much older woman, but when she was a little kid, her grandmother would give her, I think it was $2, and one of the $1 had a piece of paper, and she would go up to the ice cream man and buy her ice cream, then she would give him the piece of paper, the other $1 her grandmother's Bolita bet.
That's so low-key. Get the children to put the numbers in for you.
But it was very popular, and I've met many people that remember their grandparents playing Bolita or, for a dime, a quarter, or whatever.
And obviously, so the hustle is they would fix it.
Well, so the original Bolita was you had 100 balls, generally made out of wood. It was a Bolita set. And you would go to these like gambling palaces, and they would throw the Bolita numbers, where they would put all these balls into a bag, shake it up, and toss it into the crowd, and someone would grab onto it. Whatever number they grab would be the winning Bolita number. But they used to weigh some of them. So there's a setup at University of South Florida that they pulled a couple numbers out and they cut them, and they had lead core. So when you would throw that bag, those heavier numbers would be selected.
More likely.
Fixed.
More often.
The other thing they used to do is sometimes you'd see Bolita sets that are made out of ivory, and they would take out a number and they would put it on a block of ice or make it really cold, and then they would have people like reach in and grab it. So, I'd pick you, hey, you know what number to pick. You're going to pick the cold one. So they fixed.
Gotcha.
So the house was in on it. But
of course.
But it kind of expanded. And then it became a little bit more, I would say, straight-laced, because there were a couple different types of bolita. For example, if you played the game New York, and the guy you bought bolita from, they would get their winning numbers from the last 2 or 3 numbers of the stock market average for the day.
Okay.
So there was a way to kind of verify the legitimacy of the win. But and I think for organized crime, they figured out that even totally legit, they were still making a ton of money. The house always wins on gambling kind of thing, because the odds were so great.
In their favor, yeah. What's like the biggest, like one of the bigger, because I have some past knowledge from somebody that I knew from in the back. I guess Al Pacino had like some big influence out here, or Al Capone, one of those guys. Al Capone.
Al Pacino's the actor.
He's an actor. Yeah. And apparently, I guess like he stayed out in like the Odessa, Citrus Park area. I don't know if you know anything about that.
So, yes, Al Capone did spend time in the Tampa Bay area in the 1920s, a little bit of time. However, that was primarily in St. Petersburg and Tarpon Springs.
Okay.
The thing that's happened with Al Capone over the years, and not just here, it's happened in other parts of the country, is it's kind of become like this urban legend that Al Capone was here. He was here. He owned this house. He owned this house. Yeah. I mean, he was only active for a pretty short period of time. He was only boss for a pretty short period of time. If he owned and did as much as people say.
Right. If you start adding enough to story, shoot, he's not human.
But there is definitive evidence that he did. He owned a lot of property in St. Petersburg in the 1920s when there was a big land boom in St. Pete. Mm-hmm. He did have, obviously, he lived in Miami. And when he got out of prison, that's where he passed away, was in Miami. And there are a couple other places he would spend like a little bit of time in Florida. But I cast kind of I don't want to say I would dismiss it outright, but I think there's not quite as much evidence for some of his activities as others.
Because I had a family friend that was telling me that this house that she lived in was like a runner house or something. I guess a lot of alcohol during like the Prohibition era was like slung in and out of that house, and they had like this boarded up cell in the pantry where like they passed all the. And she said it was Al Capone's house, so I just wanted to confirm. Or
I don't know if it was Al Capone's house, but the other part sounds very realistic to the time period. There are some houses still around in Ybor City and north of Ybor that have tunnels in them. I've seen them or big chambers in their basements where we know they kept alcohol. There's records of it. So
that's actually how we found you. Was we saw videos of you exploring or showing the underground portions of Ybor.
Oh, okay.
And tunnels and stuff.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
So to your point, I think very likely that her house was probably at one time used for that. Yeah.
I mean, a little bit more. She says it's like super haunted. Like she hears knocks on that little door all the time, but we won't go into that.
In terms of Florida, who was like some major names and people that really had influence in the mob?
So Florida-wide, Miami, we'll start there and we'll come back to Tampa. Miami, and people need to realize this, Miami wasn't as big as Tampa was as a city for a good portion of the early 1900s. But then as Miami grows, it also grows a vacation destination. So mafioso from up north come down. Meyers Lansky is one in particular that had a lot of influence in Miami, out of New York. But Miami, you had guys from all over the country that were coming down to Miami in the 1960s. There were dozens of mobsters from all of the different families that were either snowbirding it or spending a good amount of time in Miami. So Miami, really, you had people like Meyers Lansky or Angelo Bruno, the longtime boss of Philly. Sam Giancana from Chicago spent time in Miami. The Fischetti brothers from Chicago. Just all these names. But from Tampa, probably the biggest name, the name that most people know, is Santo Trafficante Junior.
Trafficante, yes.
Yeah.
How do you get a name like that? That's got to be like...
No, it's the family name from Sicily. They came over. That's a name from the area in Sicily.
Incredibly ironic.
Yeah.
It's like, it sounds, well, I don't know the direct translation, but it might as well be trafficker.
Yeah.
Trafficker, smuggler.
So Santo Trafficante Junior, his father, Santo Senior, was boss before him, then Santo Junior took over. And there were a few bosses earlier as well. But Santo Junior comes into the picture late 40s, early 50s, and really makes a name on the national mafia scene and becomes very involved in Cuba, pre-Castro, very involved in Miami, has connections with New York and Chicago. And probably, interestingly, he's charged, he's indicted a few times, never spends any time in American prison. He dies in 1987, so he had a pretty long reign out of out of Tampa, but he did live in Miami for a while as well. And even though Miami was an open city, he commanded a certain level of respect down there. So even though they didn't have to, mafioso would come and, introduce themselves to him and ask for his permission to do stuff.
Checking in,
exactly. Yeah.
So is Miami an open city just because there's no long-standing mob history there? And so they just chose it as just like a let bygones be bygones area?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know the exactly when they had that sit down about it. But yeah, but there was no, Tampa had a Sicilian community. New Orleans had a Sicilian community. These other places around the country, Sicilians and Calabrians, where some of those early mafia families emerged. Miami didn't have that. But as it became a popular touristy area and guys started going there, they realized there's a lot of potential. And in order to avoid any kind of bloodshed in terms of like fighting family to family who's going to control it, there was kind of this gentleman's agreement that everyone could do what they want there. It was kind of an open city. Las Vegas being probably the other real big one, similar to that.
No territory battles in Miami, I guess. Around
no, I mean, there were some murders in Miami, but a lot of it was business related. It wasn't like, one of the things that Hollywood often talks about that you don't really see a lot of in real life are like different families fighting each other for control. A lot of the mob violence is usually internal and, petty beefs and business disputes.
Sure, within family, less interfamily.
Yeah, there have been some, but it's not as prevalent. Yeah.
How relevant is the Trafficante family like right now, modern Tampa?
No, the family itself are certainly still around. But when Santo passed away in 1987, he still had a couple brothers that were still kind of involved, but that was where it ended at that generation. And then subsequent, nephews and such weren't involved in organized crime. Now, the crime family continued on for a while and probably started dissipating, I would say, late 90s, early 2000s. There was still some stuff going on and some guys around. But the interesting thing about Tampa is it kind of fades away over time. There are still 5 or 6 guys that are still on FBI files considered made members of the mafia here, but they're in their 80s and stuff. They're just retired, not really doing anything. So the mafia as an entity, the Tampa mafia, is not really anything anymore.
Yeah. So like you said, like it died after that generation. The nephews and stuff didn't carry it on. So like what do they pivot to after that? Is it just they start buying a bunch of property, whatever?
Yeah, property, real estate, legitimate businesses. The options are a lot more wide for
legal money.
Yeah.
Are there any businesses in Tampa that are historically businesses that were mob owned that are noteworthy?
Some of the old strip clubs around, had mob ties. 2001, the one on Dale Mabry, ties back in the day. Some of the restaurants in Ybor City that are no longer what they were, but the buildings are still there, were owned by Wise. They owned a lot of bars and restaurants over the years, and there were certainly places like the Columbia. They didn't own it, but that was big hangouts for a lot of the mob guys. In fact, if you look at FBI surveillance reports, especially from the 60s, the FBI were at the Columbia all the time because that's where the mob guys were at the Columbia.
So funny.
And doing some research in the past, like when we first found your stuff, like I did a pretty deep dive on the Trafficante family. I think it said that they owned like a huge portion of 7th Avenue, like that whole road strip, like a bunch of restaurants.
In Ybor City?
Yeah. So, I mean, would you say they owned those prior to like the dissipation of it, or was it like something they just picked up, you think, after?
No, this was earlier on. Yeah, you can look some of the property records, even over in Pinellas, where Santo Trafficante Senior bought property by the Don Cesar in St. Pete Beach. Same thing. They owned parcels of land on Dale Mabry, owned some parcels in Ybor City, owned a parcel on Nebraska, a couple parcels on Nebraska. And just over the years, a few of them were legal reasons they had to give them up, but they would just sell them as part of business. So I think they viewed it more as most people do real estate as an investment.
Well, I think one of the major ones that I remember was the Tampa Bay Brewing Company. Used to be, has had several names for some reason. Is there such a family maybe you are familiar with called the Levine or Devine family?
Not ringing a bell. No.
Okay. Rumors, myths.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people don't think about how mob influenced, things were back in the day. Like, there was a lot of, I don't want to say like pressing the people, but I feel like there was a lot of influence just in the community. Like people, even like today, like gangsters, like they have like somewhat of a hold on the community, and, things go in and out kind of through them. Would you say that was like the same, type of scenario back then with them?
Yeah. So, kind of a good example with that early on is Ybor City in the Sicilian enclave. And you see this in Sicilian enclaves in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and a lot of other American cities. This phenomenon known as the Black Hand. And it's kind of the early version of the Mafia and kind of tied in with that. And they basically are preying on each other. They're preying on their community. Because, okay, here you have a new group of Sicilian immigrants. They come to this neighborhood. Well, I'm going to extort them because I know they're not going to go to the cops. So what they'll do is they'll send them these ransom letters with the imprint of a black hand on them. Ooh. And this happened in Ybor City. And there were a number of murders were part of this black hand activity in the early 1900s. And it was kind of before the Mafia kind of matured a little bit. And yeah, that's probably a good descriptor, matured and formed in more cohesive criminal structure, but a lot of them started off by victimizing their own community.
That's crazy. You had to control your own. Otherwise you have no, army of people to work like this.
Yeah, but quickly I think they also realized that by corrupting law enforcement, public officials, lawyers, that was how they were able to take it to the next step. And really, I think attitudes and things shift with prohibition, because now you don't need to, and there's still extortion going on, but you don't need to really do that to your community. Now you can provide them something that they want that they can't get. So now you go from being that guy that's shaking me down to, oh, well, he has some stuff that I want, so I'm going to go. He's the only guy that has it.
Real leverage.
That being alcohol, yeah. So,
and I'm sure, like, if like they had like some community members that would maybe like keep their ear to the streets for the mob people and like tell them stuff, kind of informants in a way.
Yeah, you had that. You had associates and guys around, and and they kind of integrate themselves in the community. An example with that is Charlie Wall, who was not a mafia guy, but he was the first like organized crime kingpin in Tampa. And he would like throw money to kids. He would help people that were, had that kind of community benefactor aspect. And meanwhile, he's also running narcotics and prostitution and gambling. So.
That's the best way to do it, though. You have to be a good patron.
Here's $1,500. Tell me if you see anybody come in here.
Yeah, exactly.
I think for most people, they feel like organized crime started with prohibition, but it starts before that.
Yeah, it started before that for sure. Prohibition really was kind of like the catalyst that took it to the next level. And you can probably argue back and forth if prohibition never happened, but it did. And really, I think there's a lot of very good evidence that it pushed. It made the mafia much stronger, made gangsters much stronger, because you were able to corrupt law enforcement. You had a lot of money coming in. And you were dealing with something that a majority of people wanted, regardless of the temperance movement and how that's viewed and maybe how big or small it was. The fact is there were still millions of people that wanted to drink a beer. They wanted a glass of wine. They wanted a cocktail. So now you have the means to produce it or import it or distribute it. And depending on which city, some cities it was all the mafia. Some were Jewish gangsters and Irish gangsters and the mafia. Some were, like in the Kentucky, you had a lot of guys running cars and just kind of an offshoot. The origins of NASCAR come from rum runners, back in the day. So yeah, it really kind of took that crime to the next level.
Yeah, because before that, what you're just doing the simple lottery type stuff,
Yeah.
a little gambling. But when you say
Laundering.
gambling palaces, like they in Tampa, like where would?
Yeah, so where the Hotel High is right now, in Ybor City on 7th, that back in the 1920s and 30s was a place called the El Dorado. It was a 2-story brick building. It was torn down in like 72, 73. But it was a cafe, but it was a gambling hall. So they would throw bolita in there. They would play cards in there. That's what it was. It was like a gambling. And the palace, not necessarily that it was really ornate, but it was like kind of a place where people would go to gamble.
True. So was that entire building, like that entire?
It was on the northwest corner of that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
But you can find some photos of it online. It's kind of a nondescript building from the outside, but
Yeah, this building's crazy. I don't know if you've ever been to Hotel High or
Yeah.
enjoyed their stuff. They've got portions of the building where obviously when they were doing renovation, they were finding all these old things and historical stuff, and they've kind of left it in portions of the building. It's pretty cool. But I remember used to hearing old rumors about not that corner, but on the other side there was a club that used to be called Tsar. There was old rumors that that was like the Russian mob or something. I guess just because it was called Tsar.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that like somehow like that rumor did have like a truth to it somewhere. Like it didn't come from nowhere. The building did have mob operations there, just on the other side, and they weren't Russian. It's not the club.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting.
The University of Tampa, was that, you said, so the whole mob thing started in like the 20s in Tampa, the 50s?
No, we start seeing the emergence of some organized crime activities related to the Black Hand in the early 1900s.
Okay, so
yeah.
was the University of Tampa, was that a hotel at that point?
Yeah, it was
Okay.
the Plant Hotel. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, like, how much, was there a lot of activity there, like, for mob stuff?
No, it was primarily in Ybor and West Tampa.
Okay.
A lot of that was kind of confined to that area.
Okay.
And you have to remember, Tampa was, 30,000 people maybe then. So it was, it was much smaller footprint of where Tampa was.
When did the tunnels get discovered?
So the tunnels of Ybor, we know for a fact there are some tunnels. It was one of those things that were kind of always whispered about. People always talked about. I've talked to people that have been in a couple of them. I've seen a couple of them. Some of them were most likely originally like just drainage tunnels. Because one of the things about Ybor that people might not realize, but if you stop and look, you'll notice, especially if you're up, say, by the Hotel High, there's a pretty decent ridge there, a slope. So it kind of slopes down towards the port of Tampa. So there's a real big tunnel there that they uncovered a few years ago. That's probably originally most likely a drainage tunnel. That being said, there are other tunnels that are between buildings. And there are some other tunnels underneath homes that that I've been to. And some of them we know for a fact, like from the 20s, that they were used to store liquor that were being brought in. I've talked to people whose relatives were involved in organized crime in the 20s, and they had hidden rooms in their house where they would store people, some of the immigrants that they were smuggling through Ybor City before they ended up in their final destination. So, yeah, there definitely is both some element, a little bit of urban legend, but not that much, because there absolutely are some tunnels in Ybor City, for a fact.
Because, I mean, you watching the video, like, obviously there's some that are just like straight corridors, and then ones that there's just a big open room. Obviously, I don't think that's for drainage, like one random open room.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, there's a house, and Lloyd Sowers did a piece with me underneath these people's homes on the Hillsborough River, and there's one tunnel that goes out like towards the river, another one that like goes in the other direction.
I remember that one. Yeah, that's crazy that it goes under the river.
Yeah,
It's deep then.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that like the thing is that you can't dig underground in Florida? Like, how is it?
Well, and funny enough, yes, but most of those tunnels and those underground things are kind of along that higher ground in Ybor and extending north of there. So you don't get a lot like on the beaches, or, even though, the water table's high in some of those areas. In parts of Ybor, a lot of those buildings have basements and subfloors and stuff. So there is a good portion of that part of town where you could have some kind of underground feature.
That's. I can only imagine thinking back there in the early 1900s, people just running immigrants in and out, people down there chilling. Because it looked like, from the video that I saw, it looked like there was like some kind of chill spot. Like people would just gather down there and maybe hang out, have some drinks or something, like some kind of grotto, if you will, or something like that. So I mean, yeah, that's I would love to be around during that time, try to experience that.
Yeah, and one of the basements, it was that one I did with Lloyd. There's a cockfighting ring in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just like a place to hang out.
And that's kind of funny because there's always a bunch of chickens around in Ybor
Yeah,
City.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, where do the chickens really come from? Ooh.
All that cockfighting. Nah, but it's Tampa's definitely got an interesting history that, not a lot of people know about. Like, I didn't even know about any type of mob influence until we even found your videos. So it was definitely a cool, thing to dive into, because I like the history of Tampa. It's a very interesting, a lot of crazy things have
Without
happened.
even the mob history.
Without even just the mob
Oh yeah,
history.
absolutely. Yeah.
So it's cool to just peel back, layer. You find something new in, Florida history.
And and the other thing too was, there were a couple time periods there, like in the 30s and again in the early 50s. It was pretty violent. There were a lot of gangland killings, and in fact, in the 30s, it was called the newspapers called it the Era of Blood, because there were a lot of gangland killings. And again, you got to remember Tampa was much smaller, so anytime one of these killings would happen, be in the papers for weeks, months at a time, and most of them were unsolved. So it was always like trying to, newspapers trying to guess who was involved and what this meant for the Bolita rackets and
Are we still gonna have Bolita?
Yeah, exactly.
That's crazy.
How deep did the, I guess, mob corruption influence go? Because you said like police officers, like did it go any higher than that? Like judges and
I always heard that was kind of like the purpose of moving to Tampa way back then.
Yeah, there were definitely some, and a lot of this came out in the Kefauver hearings. There were some judges. There was a guy named Jimmy Velasco who was killed in 1948 in Ybor, and he was like a political fixer for the mob. And Curtis Hickson, who was the mayor at the time, and there's a huge park
Hickson
named
Park,
after him down there.
Great park.
he was on the payroll. He was getting money from the mob. I talked to Jimmy Velasco's daughter, who said, we would pull up in front of Curtis Hickson's house, and Dad would go in with an envelope and be in there for however long. And so,
change the name of the park right now.
yeah.
So is there any do we know of any specific things that they might have been, what their interests were in giving him his money? What they tried to accomplish?
I think really at the base level, it's
Just turning the blind eye in general?
exactly.
Okay.
Let's give him a couple bucks, take it easy. I might give for a judge, hey, my guy gets arrested, goes in front of you. And you saw this happen with a lot of the Bolita guys. He would get basically slaps on the wrist. They'd get a fine, a little bit of probation. Once in a while, if they went to prison,
Very
6
rare.
months, year, it was a way for the mob to kind of mitigate the damage. Because if your Bolita ring got raided, that was a loss of revenue, because if people couldn't play with you, they're going to go somewhere else. So you want to make sure that keeps going. So you want those guys, even if they get arrested, let's turn them back out and get them out here. So the way to do that is spread some money to the cops, spread some money to the judges, to the lawyers.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I had heard, or I always heard that that Tampa, really, people started moving here because obviously it was just a fort back then, right? Fort Brooke, there was not much going on. But the real reason that people started moving because it was a Vegas type place, just far and out of reach of the law. And obviously back then, before AC, was hot as heck, and nobody would want to live here. So it was an opportunity that way.
That, and the cigar industry really was another big kind of thing that started bringing people to the area. When Ybor came and built the cigar factories, that kind of helped bring a lot of immigration to the area. And again, now you had people, they had a lot of money. On Fridays, they would get paid at the cigar factories. And I've talked to people who know a lot more about the history of the cigar industry, but some of them would have like a Bolita guy selling Bolita, So
that seems to be a very popular thing.
Yeah,
It was everywhere.
It was a numbers racket, and you find it in not just Tampa. Well, Bolita was kind of unique to Tampa and later to Miami, but you find numbers rackets in New York City and Chicago. They called it policy up there, New Orleans, all these other cities. So
This might be completely unrelated, but I mean, it's gambling. So is there any like relationship between like the casinos like on the reservations and the mob? Like do they ask people in the mob to like teach them? Like you got to learn that kind of stuff somewhere.
Not really in Florida with the Seminoles. There were maybe a couple people in the early years but it was really not. I would say no. Certainly not now. Other parts of the country, there were a few instances of Indian reservations having some mob ties, but really, for the longest time up in through the 1980s, the Mafia, with the exception of Tampa, really were focused on Vegas because they actually had ins with some of the casinos. They actually owned parts of it. So, when you have this gambling mecca and all these smaller ones start popping up, it's not really, on their radar as much.
Priority, yeah.
And from people I've talked to in gambling enforcement, it's nowadays especially, it's impossible for anyone that's mobbed. Not impossible, very difficult for anyone that's mobbed up or criminal record to get involved in any capacity in a casino operation.
Yeah, I'm sure feds are all over those places.
Yeah,
constantly.
Well, you got to be Native American to begin with. I feel like isn't that like a law? Like it's only Native Americans that can
Probably
have.
not your area of expertise.
Yeah, that's I'm not really sure on that.
That seems a little.
But nowadays especially with sports gambling, and that's another thing why maybe the mob is not as powerful generally, is a lot of the stuff that they had was their bread and butter is now legal, especially in the gambling sphere. Now you have casinos in almost every state. New York City's getting casinos.
You got a casino on your phone?
You got a casino on your phone. Yeah, now sports betting, you just pull up an app. You don't need to find your bookie.
Exactly. You're not going to get pressed for whatever money you owe them through the app.
No, they'll just,
they'll just take it.
Find another way.
There is no press. They just take it.
But no, I like this, man. This is a good conversation. Mob stuff. Because
I know you're on the Wikipedia page. I don't know if you knew that.
No, I didn't.
I was like, did he write that himself?
No, I didn't.
Somebody referenced you, yeah.
Yeah, they probably referenced it.
You search Tampa mob history on the Wikipedia pages.
There have been a couple other people that have written stuff tied into Tampa, but it's definitely kind of an area of expertise of mine for now. And it's funny, I was just talking to another mob author I know. We all kind of have our territories. Like there's guys that write about Cleveland, and there's guys that write about Detroit. New York's a little open because it's so big.
Some stories get a little too far away. You need to cross-reference with another expert.
Yeah, well, you got to pay your respects to the Pittsburgh guy before you write about Pittsburgh or something like that.
Nice.
It's there's been a lot of more information that's come out, even with the Tampa stuff over the years since I've written the book. Even now that more stuff, as I mentioned earlier, is online. The FBI has been releasing a lot more material, a lot of stuff that came out of the JFK files that have been declassified that has come out over the last 20 years. A lot of it had to do with Tampa, so there's been a ton of information.
I can't remember. Maybe I'm making this up. That Trafficante had something to do with alleged plans of assassination.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there are, and we don't have 5 hours to go down this.
Sure we do.
But there are a lot of conspiracy theories around Kennedy, a lot that have to do with the Mafia.
That's why they named that street after him.
Yeah, and almost all the ones that have to do with the Mafia, Trafficante is involved somehow. Carlos Marcello from New Orleans is usually his name comes up, or Sam Giancana from Chicago. And it all kind of the Trafficante stuff stems from Cuba, because Trafficante and the Tampa mob owned a number of Cuban casinos in Havana pre-Castro. When Castro took over, he took the casinos. Trafficante actually stayed in Havana. He was jailed by Castro. Was eventually let go and came back to the United States, and he was approached by the CIA. This is fact. This is not conspiracy. Trafficante was approached by the CIA to kill Fidel Castro because the CIA figured because Trafficante still had some contacts on the island. They wanted Castro out of the picture. It's very simplistic oversimplification of complex geopolitics, but boiling it down to it is they had a meeting at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, and this gentleman, Robert Mayhew, who was kind of a conduit between the CIA and the Mafia, gave the money to Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santo Trafficante. Obviously, Castro just died a few years ago, so nothing ever really came to fruition on that. But that's kind of going from there to some of the stuff about the Kennedy assassination. And there's a lot of very compelling evidence that in 1959, when Trafficante was in prison in Cuba, he was visited by Jack Ruby there, who Jack Ruby eventually kills Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin of JFK. So that's just kind of a little too coincidental. I'll just say that.
So if Trafficante was Sicilian?
Yes, yeah. Most of the Tampa mafioso were Sicilian from a couple villages in Sicily.
So how do you get such a deep connection to Cuba, like having so much strings pulled over there?
So, that's a really good question. You have to remember, in the early years of Ybor City, it was a very unique ethnic enclave, especially for the Deep South at that time. So you had the Sicilian immigrants, you had Spanish immigrants. There was also a large Cuban population. So you had that Cuban connection. You had travel back and forth to Havana. You had a very prominent trade between Port Tampa and Port of Havana. So the Tampa guys, long before Trafficante, during the Prohibition era, they already set up operations and had these criminal networks operating between Havana and Tampa for narcotics, for liquor, for people. And those continued on. In the post-World War II era, as Havana starts to boom and they start building hotels and casinos, Trafficante, mafioso from around the country like Meyers Lansky, they see Havana as an opportunity to actually build legitimate casinos and hotels because they have a friendly government, and I'm throwing up the air quotes because they paid money to Batista.
So whereas Vegas was territory that they would have to move into, Havana was a blank slate, or
but
easier for them to have complete control.
They already had very close connections, and Trafficante, grown up in Ybor, understood, spoke Spanish, understood Cuban culture. There were a lot of Cuban organized crime figures already in Cuba that they all had connections to. So it was, for Trafficante and some of those guys, it was a closer connection. And this kind of is a reason, too, why Trafficante was never heavily involved in Las Vegas. Because while, Las Vegas was heavily mobbed up, Trafficante was focused on Cuba. And even after he lost Cuba, he was still focused on other areas in the Caribbean, Central South America. So never was involved in Vegas from the mob angle.
So was he the only guy that was like influencing Cuba like that? Was it just a Trafficante?
No, there were a lot of mafioso from around the country, guys from New York.
Meyers Lansky, right?
Meyers Lansky, Luciano was in there. Like the Manarino brothers from New Kensington, Pennsylvania. They were tied with the Pittsburgh Mafia, guys from Chicago, New Orleans. So yeah, there was a good cross-section of other mobsters. But Trafficante and Meyers Lansky, probably the two that had the most pull, the most juice down there.
If the Trafficantes, so like, I guess you gave the whole explanation on why they picked Cuba, but I guess I don't really see exactly why. There's so many other places. Is it just because it was so close to Miami? I mean, they could have gone to Puerto Rico. They could have done whatever, like you said, Central America. Like
Havana was already a tourist destination, so you already had a lot of tourism there. It was pretty prosperous at that time. There were always close connections with the United States and Cuba. So just from a geographical perspective, it was
just easier.
Logical. And yeah, and now it's a 50-minute flight to Cuba from Tampa, even closer from Miami. So, I talk to people, much older people now, like they would go to a weekend in Havana. That'd be your, hey, what are you doing this weekend? Let's go down to Havana and visit the casinos.
Yeah, I'm Cuban. My father told me he had an uncle that used to fly back and forth to Key West all the time, and they called him Gringo because that's how often he did it.
What's like a crazy, I guess, like mob killing story, I guess, for Tampa? Like, what was like a huge story?
Or a few. Well, let's talk about Charlie Wall. So, by the mid-1920s, Charlie Wall, he's called the Dean of the Underworld. He's really firmly in control of a good chunk of organized crime in Tampa. What's interesting about Charlie Wall is he doesn't come from the streets of Ybor. His father was one of the most respected, a one-time mayor. His family and his extended family, they're like the blue blood elite of Tampa, the founding families of Tampa. He takes a little bit of a different path and becomes this kind of crime lord. And in the 1930s, there's a war between Charlie Wall and the Mafia for control of the rackets. And Charlie Wall is shot at 3 separate times in the 1930s and not killed. He evades. Probably the one mobster evaded the most assassination attempts, Charlie Wall. Kind of gets forced out of the rackets. Fast forward to 1955. At this time, he's kind of a drunk old man around town, still kind of wistfully pining for the old days of being the boss. Starts getting into some issues with the Mafia, more like personal beefs. And one night in April of 1955, he's drinking at a mob-owned bar, gets pretty drunk, he gets driven home. His wife's out of town visiting her sister. So he goes in his house, and at some point at that night, somebody knocked at the door that he knew, and he let him in. A couple days later, his wife comes home, she opens the front door, she walks to the back room of the house. Charlie's there with his throat cut and his head bashed in with like a police blackjack.
Oh my God.
And it's still an unsolved killing. I talked to one of the officers who investigated it. They had some mob suspects that they thought were involved. But yeah, so he evaded all these killings and only to 20 years later to be the victim. And it was somebody he knew because he let them in the house. And,
I'll say someone was keeping tabs on him all those years for sure.
But Charlie Wall wasn't Sicilian or Italian.
No. Yeah. No.
That's interesting.
And the other thing that was kind of interesting about these crimes is, and I talk about this, I do walking tours of Ybor, Mafia tours. And, I always ask people, when you think of like, especially in the 1920s, you think about gangsters like Capone or that era, what kind of gun do you think of? You think
Tommy gun.
Tommy gun, the machine gun. Never once used in Tampa. The weapon of choice that they used here were sawed-off double-barrel shotguns.
That's what I heard.
That's badass.
That the Tommy gun was just for the movies. Really, they used shotguns.
Sawed-offs, yeah. I mean, that movie with Johnny Depp, that mob movie, they're using sawed-offs in that.
Yeah, they did. They did use Tommy guns more so up north, like Chicago and stuff. But Tampa, the shotguns were. I mean, once in a while there were handguns used, but shotguns were definitely the weapon.
Weapon of choice.
You can't help but think that maybe Charlie Wall was allowed into the mob for like convenience because he came from such an influential family.
Well, that I think enabled him to gain his power base too, because he already had those connections to the kind of the elite of Tampa. I think that was a reason he was able to get his power
Move up the ranks.
Earlier than what it took the Mafia a little time to kind of get up to where he was.
How many bodies you think there are floating to a cement block in the bay right now?
Actually, very few of the guys went missing. A lot of the killings were pretty out in the open.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
They were pretty brazen. Some
No
of them
sleeping
were
with the fishes.
Some of them were like right in the middle of Ybor City, and
Blasted.
nobody would see anything.
Supposedly.
Yeah. There are a few that have gone missing, and there's a couple that disappeared, but more often than not, they were pretty brazen open
Laying in the
killings.
street. Yeah. That's crazy.
Nothing's been like uncovered or like accidentally unburied, unmarked graves.
No. Another one was interesting. It was two guys, Angelo Giglio and Rene Nunez, in '52. They were invited to look at this a property off Hillsborough Avenue. It was like a under construction property. They were supposed to meet someone there, and they were both killed at the same time. They went to this place, and they were shotgunned.
And wait, who were these gentlemen again?
They were Bolita guys. They were involved in Bolita.
Okay, so that's why.
So.
No, that's nuts. You never think about like Tampa having that side, like ever, that mob connection. Not even really like gang in general. Like it's not really big like that here.
I wonder if they'll expose that a little bit in the in Grand Theft Auto 6. I don't know if you ever heard of the video game Grand Theft Auto.
I've heard of it. I've not played it, but I'm familiar with it.
So they're pretty satirical in their in the way that they like write the plots and stories and stuff like that. And Tampa is going to be in the next game. Will include Miami, Orlando, and Tampa. It's a game mostly about organized crime.
Yeah,
and stuff.
interesting.
So I'm wondering if they'll add anything in terms of like, satire on actual mob and organized crime history, because it's a game about organized crime.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about that. Looking forward to that game.
Might be.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
It's the first time Florida's actually getting like an open world game like that.
I think you don't play video games.
No. but I'm certainly familiar with a lot of them, just because I think
Popular
nowadays,
culture.
video games just inform so much of popular culture that it's hard to not at least be somewhat familiar with what they are.
You obviously, this is like a bunch of information that you've had through self-research. Do you have a formal education?
Oh yeah. I'm actually, this is just a side gig. My background's a degree in marine biology and I'm in environmental sciences. So
Cool.
I have no formal degree in writing or researching. That was a lot of
Self-taught.
self-taught, a lot of trial and error, especially the research part and writing too. I mean, I read some of the early stuff I wrote. I'm like, ugh.
Naturally.
Funny enough, I've never read a book I've written.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
'cause-
I mean, you wrote it. Why you got to read it?
Yeah, because I've read it enough times, like in the thing, but
Collectively, yeah.
once it's printed and bound, I get that first. I just put it up on the shelf.
Yeah.
So, I'll go back and look for stuff if I need research. But yeah, a lot of that was just over the years learning what worked, especially in the research thing, making connections, getting to know people, getting to know where to find things.
Surfing the internet, talking
yeah.
to people in the online forums,
Yeah, and
back in the day,
knowing where to go and what to.
praying to God and
look
Y2K didn't destroy everything.
Yeah.
Do they have like an archive somewhere where you can go and like find all the history of like whatever crime happened with the mob in the past in Tampa? Like, is there?
There's not. There's some online, like Mary Farrell is a website that amasses a lot of FBI files. It's really related more to the JFK assassination, but there's a ton of general mafia stuff and there's a lot of Tampa stuff in there. I probably have a huge chunk of both digital and hard copy files of stuff. Not all of it original, some of it, yeah. I donated I have some original mugshots and photos and stuff. I've donated those to the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, both because I think it'd be cool to, and I'm involved with them on the advisory council of the museum. So having Tampa featured in the museum, I think is important from a historical perspective.
Absolutely.
Also, they keep stuff really, they know how to keep stuff because
right.
a lot of the,
It's not easy to store and maintain those documents. Keep
exactly,
them
especially
safe.
like old newspapers. Now they're almost 100 years old. That it's hard to keep that, especially in this heat and humidity. So
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like, what if I wanted to read like a newspaper of one of the killings of a mob guy?
yeah, go on newspapers.com.
Okay. Yeah.
They've done a tremendous job at digitizing those archives. Not only the Tampa Tribune, but like the Tampa Times, which was this daily newspaper that I can't remember exactly when it went defunct, or the St. Petersburg Evening Independent, newspapers that were around during that time period. And yeah, that's the best way to do it, because having to go, as someone who used to have to go digging through the old original clippings, it's a
Tedious.
godsend. Be able to just hit search for a name and then have it pop
Yeah,
up.
I'm sure you have a very interesting home office.
Do you guys know what microfiche is?
Microfiche? What is that?
That's what they used to have old newspapers on, and it was long, like film strip, and you would go in the library, and it'd be like a reel to reel, and each, you would have like this screen above you and this little light, and it would shine on one page, and it would come up on the screen, and you would manually have to go page by page.
I've
and
seen
get the
that.
paper.
I've seen that machine before.
Yeah.
Randomly there was a teacher in my middle school that was blind, and for some reason that machine helped him look at all of the, because I guess it was like some sort of film.
Yeah, and it was real
various
bright,
documents
like,
were in that format for him to look at through the machine.
Yeah,
it was weird.
But that was state of the art when I started research. I was like, oh, you got to go to the microfiche machine.
Yeah, look, they preserved all the newspapers. It's amazing.
It seems like a manual use, like overhead projector. Is it like the same?
Very similar concept. Okay. Yeah. But none of it was archived, so you just had to figure, oh, this might have happened in this time period. So you go
flip through
it. Yeah, it was time.
Oh man. Oh, research back in the 90s must have been terrible. Finding anything.
Getting kicked out of the library. But I almost found it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. So we usually close out with paranormal questions. If you have ever experienced anything that you couldn't explain, ever saw anything.
Ghosts, ghouls, something moving.
No, not
misplaced.
That no, I haven't. But I've certainly, as a kid, you're always like, think about those kind of things. So I will share with you, though, as a kid, not that I believed in it, but it was an integral part of kind of a paranormal part of culture of growing up in New Jersey.
Okay.
Is the Jersey Devil.
Right.
Which I used to have a big poster of on my wall as a kid. And, it's based on a legend of this monster that exists in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, a cryptid, maybe more so than paranormal.
Right, yeah.
But, so that was but I loved all that stuff growing up, for sure. I was a big fan of the paranormal. By secondary, my mom, there used to be this, I'm probably still there, in Monmouth County, New Jersey, there was a house called the Spy Museum. And it was used as a spy place during the Revolutionary War. British spies would come to it. And it's supposed to be super haunted. So we were there and I was standing next to her. And she screamed and ran out of the room.
Your mother?
Yeah. She said it felt like somebody put a cold hand on her neck and there was nobody there behind her. So yeah, tangential paranormal experience.
All right, fair enough.
That works.
Yeah.
Was it marine biology that made you move to Florida?
Yeah, I went to Eckerd College, so that's what came down here for that. So.
Cool. All right.
I got a question. So the Jersey Devil, what is the story behind it? Why is it? Why'd they pick the devil? Is it they come and take kids in the night, or what was it? So the chupacabra.
This might not be 100% correct, but this is kind of the joke. There was a family that lived in the Pine Barrens, the Leeds family, and they had 12 kids, and the wife was pregnant again, and she cursed. She said, if this kid comes out, it'll be the devil, and supposedly was born with hooves and wings, and they kept it in the basement, and then it escaped into the night, and it's been haunting the Jersey.
Don't have 13 kids, Gabe. That's the moral of the story.
That's a simplified version. I think there might be some other kind of things, but that's kind of it. So yeah, that's where the hockey team, the Jersey Devils, that's where they get the name from.
It seems like every state has its own cryptid
exactly,
or
absolutely.
whatever.
Oh, with the skunk ape in
skunk
Florida.
Ape, yeah. I've seen some videos.
Yeah. So.
Well, yeah, man. Thanks for coming by.
Absolutely.
It was a great conversation. I learned a lot. You definitely shared some good information.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, guys.
Do you have any social media or anything?
Yeah.
YouTube?
So all my social, both my personal website, all my books are Tampa Mafia Tours. Just go to tampamafia.com. It's kind of a repository for everything Tampa Mafia related.
And if you want to get tours, he does it in Ybor.
Yep.
Ybor Tours. Buy his book.
Thanks, guys.
Peace.
Have a good one.
Thank you, guys.